Hi friends! It was so good to see most of you today on our Zoom chat. I enjoyed it. I had fun. I hope you did too. I will let you know when we're going to do another one and how we're going to do it from here on out. But I just wanted to know I enjoyed seeing all of you. I miss you very much. I am ready to read chapter 15. This one is called Poppers Performing Penguins. Remember from yesterday, they were in Mr. Greenbaum's office talking to him about being in his theater. At that moment, they were interrupted by the manager, who came in with a groan. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "The marvelous Marcos, who closed the program, haven't turned up, and the audience is demanding their money back." "Well, what are you going to do?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Give it to them, I suppose. And here it is, Saturday night, the biggest night of the week. I hate to think of losing all that money." "I have an idea," said Mrs. Popper. "Maybe you won't have to lose it. As long as it's the end of the program, why don't we just have the penguins rehearse in there, on a real stage? We'll have more room, and I think the audience would enjoy it." "All right," said the manager. "Let's try it." So the penguins had their first rehearsal on a real stage. The manager stepped out onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his hand, "with your kind indulgence, we're going to try out a little novelty number tonight. Owing to unforeseen circumstances, the marvelous Marcos are unable to appear. We're going to let you see a rehearsal of the Popper Performing Penguins instead. I thank you." In a very dignified way, the Poppers and the Penguins all walked out on the stage, and Mrs. Popper sat down at the piano. "Aren't you going to take your gloves off to play?" asked the manager. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Popper. "I'm so used to playing with them that I'll just keep them on if you don't mind." Then she started Schubert's Military March. The penguins began to drill very nicely, wheeling and changing their formations with great precision until Mrs. Popper stopped playing in the middle of the piece. The audience clapped vigorously. "Oh, there's more to it," explained Mrs. Popper, half to the manager and half to the audience. Where they form in a hollow square, and they march in that formation. But it's so late, we'll just skip that part tonight and jump to the second part." "Are you sure you don't want to take your gloves off, ma'am?" asked the manager. Mrs. Popper smilingly shook her head and began the Merry Widow Waltz. 10 of the penguins now formed a semicircle as Nelson and Columbus in their midst put on a wild sparring contest. Their round black heads leaned so far back so they could watch each other with both of their round white eyes. "Gork," said Nelson, punching Columbus in the stomach with his right flipper and then trying to push him over with his left flipper. There's a picture of Nelson and Columbus sparring. So I have a question for you. If they were sparring, what do you think the word sparring means? Let me know tomorrow, or send me an email. What does it mean to spar? "Go," said Columbus, going into a clinch and hanging his head over Nelson's shoulder as he tried to punch him in the back. "Hey, no fair," said the manager. Columbus and Nelson broke loose as the other 10 penguins, looking on, all applauded with their flippers. Columbus now sparred politely with Nelson until Nelson hit him in the eye, whereupon Columbus retreated with a loud "Ork!" The other penguins began to clap, and the audience joined them. As Mrs. Popper finished the waltz, both Nelson and Columbus stopped fighting. They put down their flippers and stood still and faced each other. "Which bird won? Who's ahead?" shouted the audience. "Gook," said all the 10 penguins in the semicircle. That must have meant "look," for Nelson turned to look at them, and Columbus immediately punched him right in the stomach with one flipper and knocked him down with the other. Nelson laid there with his eyes closed. Columbus then counted 10 over the prostrate Nelson, and again the 10 other penguins applauded. "That's part of the act," explained Janie. "The other penguins all like for Columbus to win, so they all say 'gook' at the end, and that makes Nelson look away so that Columbus can sock him real good." Nelson now rose up to his feet, and all the penguins formed a row and bowed to the manager. "Thank you," said the manager, bowing back. "Now comes part 3, said Mr. Popper. said Mr. Popper. "Oh, Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "you forgot to bring the step ladders and the board." "Oh, that's all right," said the manager. "I'll get the stagehands to bring some." In no time at all, a pair of ladders and a board were brought in, and Mr. Popper and the children showed them how the ladders had to be set up with the board resting on top. Then Mrs. Popper began playing the pretty descriptive piece called "By the Brook." At this point in the act, the penguins always forgot their discipline, and they got dreadfully excited. They would all begin shoving at once to see who could be the first one to climb the ladders. However, the children had always told Mr. Popper that the act was all the funnier for this pushing and scrambling, and Mr. Popper supposed it was. So now, with a great deal of squawking, the penguins fought and climbed the ladders, ran across the board in complete confusion, often knocking each other entirely off to the floor below, and then hurried to toboggan down the other ladder and knock off any penguins who were trying to climb up that side. This part of the act was very wild and noisy, in spite of Mrs. Popper's delicate music. The manager and the audience were all holding their sides. They were laughing so hard. At last, Mrs. Popper got to the end of the music, and she took off her gloves. "You'll have to get these ladders off the stage, or I'll never get these birds under control," said Mr. Popper. The curtain's supposed to fall at this point. And there's a picture. You can see Mrs. Popper playing the piano, and the penguins going up and down the ladder, and Mr. Popper standing there behind them. I can imagine how crazy that must have looked and sounded. So the manager gave the signal for the curtain to go down, and the audience stood up and cheered. When the ladders had been taken away, the manager had 12 ice cream cones brought in for the penguins, and then Janie and Bill started to cry, so the manager ordered several more, and everyone had one. Mr. Greenbaum was the first to congratulate the Poppers. "I don't mind telling you, Mr. Popper, I think you've got something absolutely unique in those birds. Your act is a sensation, and the way you helped my friend the manager here shows that you're real troopers, the kind we need in show business. I would like to predict that your penguins will soon be packing the biggest theaters from Oregon to Maine. And now to come to terms, Mr. Popper," he continued. "How about a 10-week contract at $5,000 a week?" "Is that all right, Mama?" asked Mr. Popper. "Yes, that's very satisfactory," answered Mrs. Popper. "Well then," said Mr. Greenbaum, "if you'll just sign these papers and be ready to open next week in Seattle." "Thanks again," said the manager. "Would you mind putting your gloves on for just a minute again, Mrs. Popper? I'd like for you to start playing that military march again and let the penguins parade for a minute. I want to get my ushers in here to look at those birds. That could be a lesson for them." "Oh, it sounds like maybe their money problems are getting a little bit better. It sounds like the penguins were a hit, and $5,000 a week. I think the Poppers aren't going to be having to eat beans anymore. What do you think?" All right, I hope you enjoyed today's chapter, and I will send you chapter 16 tomorrow. Have a good evening. Bye.